Good morning, dear participants. I'm sure you've had a wonderful time going through the earlier modules under the National Resource Center given to Sri Ram College of Commerce in the area of economics. Time has flown, and today we are concluding the series of the National Resource Center in the area of economics. The concluding lecture of mine would be on research writing and book review. No matter how much you've studied, the objective then comes down to how do you then convert it into writing, whether it's writing for a research paper or a doctoral thesis or a book review. And in today's lecture, the idea would be to inform the participants on what are some of the good tools wherein they could take forward research writing and review of a book. Often one asks the question, what is research? It is an activity of gathering, analyzing and interpreting information for meaningful insights. Important words, you have to gather the data, you have to analyze the data, you have to interpret the data, and from this you have to take out meaningful insights. At this point of time, allow me to give a quote. Research is formalized curiosity. It is poking and prying with a purpose. It was given by Zora Hurston from 1891 to 1960. She was an American author. Now, if you look up the words in this particular quote, it is a curiosity, but just not a curiosity. It is a formalized curiosity. Research too, you have to be curious about a particular objective, how you want to attain it. You have to formalize your hypothesis. And then if you go back to the quote, it says it is poking and prying. Now, often in general English, poking and prying have a marginally negative connotation. But if it is poking and prying with a purpose, then it is certainly going to be good tools for a fantastic research. What do you poke? What do you pry? It's your data. You have to fall in love with your data. You have to fall in love with your work. You have to fall in love with research. So much so, you should be eating, walking and sleeping with your research. When we talk about a research writing, can we say what are some of the logical ways in which a research is to be written? Are there typical tools in which one could take it forward? Certainly. And if we talk about the basic tips or the logical chronology with which you have to take forward a research, the first amongst them would be the title. And it is important over here for the participant to understand what is the difference between a title and a topic. Often in our day-to-day conversations, when we are talking to the young researchers and we ask them what is the topic in which you are researching, they end up giving us the title of their research. What is the difference? Topic is a broader concept. Title is a very, very focused area of your particular research. Immediately following the title would be the abstract of your research work. And when we are through with the abstract, it should be followed with keywords and thereafter the JEL classification of your research work. Abstract is going to be a very good substitute if somebody does not have the entire time to go through your research. So, good abstract must give the motivation, the objective of the research, the methodology that has been adopted, followed by the main findings and policy implications coming thereof. And after all this is done, we then come to the actual writing part of your research paper, which we call the body of the research paper. You should often use the funnel approach, which means you should introduce the reader to the broader perspective of the issue and gradually narrow it down to, let's say, from a global perspective to a regional perspective, thereafter maybe to the Indian perspective, and if there is a case study in India, then you come down to the case study. So, you are starting with a broader perspective and then narrowing down to your specialized objective. A very important another paragraph that has to be inserted in this section is on the flow of the research article. You must say this particular research has 5 sections. In section 1 this is done, followed by section 2 and thereafter. And generally when we are talking about what are the logical ways of developing a research paper, often you will be talking about the review of the literature, what others have reviewed in this area. One section is devoted to that, followed by a section on the methodology, your data sets and your data sources. Thereafter, your findings. And findings could be both. You could be working on the non-econometric findings in the form of crosstabs or graphical representations or simple statistical tools, followed by your econometric part of the thesis or the research paper, which is based upon your theoretical foundations. And finally, what do? You give your conclusion, whatever is emerging from the thesis, followed by implications for policy. Now, each one of these is a very important subsection in your research article. It's not necessary that your title is to be the perfect title before you start writing on your research article. You could start off with a working title, and once your entire research has been formalized, you could come back and give the exact title to your research article. Similarly, even your introduction part need not necessarily be the final version before you start writing the other sections of your research article. You could come back to it. An abstract often, even though we have a working kind of an abstract, often the final version comes when the entire paper has been written. So you do have the freedom of switching between your sections while writing a research article. Why do you think it is important that once your objective has been met, that you have to review what others have done? The simple logic for this is, research is like a puzzle. There are several pieces of puzzles and they have to be put together. You have identified a particular area of research and you want to work on that gap in the puzzle. But what if somebody else has already researched on it? So if you start working without even knowing what others have done, it may lead to wastage of time, energy and resources. So knowing what others have done is a very important tool before you start working on your own objective. And how do you narrow down to an objective? Again, a very difficult task. Research is not simple. There are steps which are tough. Over time, you learn the tricks of the trade, so to say. Identifying on a topic is the toughest, and I often tell my PhD scholars, the day you've narrowed down to your topic, expect that 30% of your research work is done. And from this topic, if you've been able to identify 3 or 4 good objectives and finally narrow down to your title of the thesis, that gives you so much of clarity that even though in terms of the ambiguity related to your PhD, I would say 50% gets resolved, but in terms of the work that is now going to be involved, that is immense. Every objective you will be needing a couple of months to work on it. And if it's a research article, let us say if it's a thesis, I'm talking about one particular publication out of a chapter. Or if you're already a doctoral student and you're working on writing a distinct research publication, then it's another article where one theme has to be dealt with, identified and resolved, and policy implications emerging. When we talk about what could be the ideal way of formulating your regression equation, it is important that you must know how your variables have been defined and how your model has been specified. I'll pick up a couple of observations over here. For example, you are talking about the temperature variation amongst different countries of the globe. Some are providing the temperature in Fahrenheit. Supposing our objective is to find out how temperature is varying across the globe. There are some countries which are reporting temperature in Fahrenheit, while there are some countries who might be giving it in Celsius. Now, how do you interpret a 36-degree Fahrenheit and a 36-degree Celsius? So, the units have to be common. Another example could be, supposing we talk about total GDP as one of the variables. For obvious reasons, GDP in a bigger country, ceteris paribus, is going to be larger than the GDP of a smaller country. You cannot compare unless your GDP is in terms of per capita, or maybe it is in terms of the growth rate of the GDP. Another example that could be is, are you working with real GDP numbers or are you working with nominal GDP? Data must be normalized, it should be deflated, they should be standardized, they should be comparable. So you must ensure that your variables are following this fundamental rule. Then comes what could be the functional form of your regression models. Several functional forms of regression models are available. For example, we could be talking about linear models, log linear models, log-lin models, lin-log models, reciprocal models, log of reciprocal models. Which particular model is to be picked up will depend upon the relationship we expect between the variables, both explanatory variables and your dependent variable. If a linear relationship is expected, use the normal linear model. In this case, how do we interpret the beta coefficient? It is a slope. It is the change in y due to a 1 unit change in x. X is your right hand side explanatory variable, y is your dependent variable. What if the equation is actually multiplicative? Even though it may not be linear in its original form, multiplicative equations can be converted into linear in their logarithmic forms. So you could have a log linear relationship. The advantage of adopting a log linear relationship in economics is immense, because the coefficients over here give you the direct elasticities. Basically, it means the change in y due to change in x is not absolute but now relative. In other words, a 1% change in x would lead to an x% change in y. So they are becoming proportionate changes in your explanatory and your dependent variables. And it's a very commonly and a very useful kind of a functional form of a regression equation. What if either your explanatory variable or your dependent variable, one of them is in its logarithmic form but not the other? How do you interpret a coefficient over here? Supposing we take the case of a log-lin model. My right hand side, which is my explanatory variable, is now in its linear term, which is just x, but my left hand side becomes a log y. How do I interpret the coefficient beta here? It would be a 1 unit change in my right hand side, which is my x, will lead to x proportionate change in y. So my numerator now becomes a relative change, denominator is an absolute change. Just the reverse will happen if the model is a lin-log model. In a lin-log model, my left hand side, which is my dependent variable, would be in its linear form, but on the right hand side, my explanatory variable in its logarithmic form. So how do I interpret the beta coefficient which has been estimated? It would be a 1% change in my x would lead to so many units change in my y variable. So your numerator is now in absolute terms, but your denominator now is going to be in relative terms. Similarly, there are so many other functional forms of regression equations, and depending upon what kind of a relationship you wish to explore, it is very important to identify the correct model specification. I take two examples over here. For example, you want to work out the estimated relationship between CO2 emissions and the GDP per capita of an economy. And this relationship has been given by Simon Kuznets, and it is known as inverted U-shaped curve, which is given the name of environmental Kuznets curve. Now, because the hypothesis is that there is a non-linear relationship in the form of an inverted U-shape, our model must incorporate that. In other words, if my left-hand variable is CO2 emissions, my right-hand variable should not simply be GDP growth or GDP per capita. Additionally, it must also have the square of its term. How do I interpret the coefficients of just GDP per capita and the square of GDP per capita? GDP per capita, if it is positive and significant, and if the second coefficient, which is the coefficient of GDP square, if that is negative and significant, interpretation would be that as the GDP per capita goes up, CO2 goes up, it is going up at a decreasing rate because my second coefficient is negative and significant. So, a threshold level would be attained of GDP per capita, prior to which emissions and GDP per capita move in the same direction, but beyond that the directional relationship changes. So, if we hypothesize that the relationship is going to be inverse U-shaped, but yet we do not account for it in our model and continue to assume a linear relationship, we are not going to be getting the best fit of the model. I take another example, which is of age and age square. Often we are interested to find out if CO2 emissions are taking place at a firm level, what are the correlates of the firm which determine the CO2 at the firm level, along with so many other variables that could be incorporated, which we call the control variables. One variable is age of the firm. Do older firms emit more or do newer firms emit more? To study this relationship, if you incorporate age, it is often advised that you should also have the square of the age. Why? Because if the beta coefficient of age is positive and significant, then it implies that older firms are emitting more. But if the beta coefficient of the squared term is negative and significant, it implies that older firms emit more, but they are emitting more at a decreasing rate. So, the rate of change with age is also expected to change. Having dealt with the simple forms of model specification, we bring in another concept. This is that of a dummy variable. We will also be dealing with endogeneity and concepts such as interaction terms and GMM estimation. It takes time for a researcher to understand the nuances of each one of these. For example, when are you going to adopt a dummy variable approach? If your data is not quantifiable, but it is actually a qualitative data. And the classic example in the textbooks is if you are a male versus a female and we want to study the dietary consumption expenditure or of a male versus a female headed household, or food insecurity of a male versus a female headed household. How are we going to interpret the variable male versus female? It's a dummy variable. If there are two categories and there is an intercept in your equation, estimation equation, the dummy would be 1. So, for all male headed households, let us say if you are writing a 1 in your Excel sheet, the reference category automatically becomes a female headed households. So, the coefficient, if here turns out to be positive and significant, the coefficient of a dummy where the dummy is representing a male headed household, it has to be interpreted as follows. As compared to the reference category of females, male headed households have this particular parameter more than the female headed household. So, that is the interpretation of a dummy. I give you 4 or 5 examples where dummies could be used. One I have already mentioned is male headed households versus female headed household. Another could be, supposing you want to handle social groups, SCs, STs, OBCs and others. If there are 4 categories, there will be 3 dummies and each coefficient has to be interpreted with respect to the base category. If it is something you want to analyze with respect to religion, again let us say your religious categories are Hindu, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians and others, there will be dummies that are created and your interpretations of the beta coefficient would be with reference to the base category, whichever it is, that does not matter. If you want to identify locational differences, rural versus urban poverty, in a panel data analysis, you must have households which belong to the urban area categorized by a dummy vis-a-vis the reference category of rural or vice versa, because I mentioned the reference categories are interchangeable. Sometimes you might be interested to know What if it is a male-headed household and is also employed in the farm sector? So you're not just interested to know what if it is a male-headed household, what is its effect on earnings, but you want to say that it is a male-headed household and it is also working in the farm sector. So there's an interaction between two variables, and my interaction would be, in this case, both are my dummies. It's a male-headed household by itself is a dummy variable, and if you're employed in the farm sector, that is another dummy. So interactions between dummies are also possible. I now move on to the next case, which is that of endogeneity. What if my regression equation y is a function of x1, x2 and xn and so on? Some of the variables on the right hand side are causing my left hand side, but left hand side is also being impacted by the right hand side. How do you handle this kind of an endogeneity problem? You have to have an IV estimation, instrument variable approach, that is what we call. And the best way of dealing with this is to adopt a 2SLS model, two-stage least squares model. And when several variables are also having this kind of an endogeneity, often we could also make use of the GMM estimation approach. And it is very positive that most of the students of economics and the young faculty I am observing are actually knowing so much more of these techniques than what was erstwhile known to them. Whatever discussions I have taken forward with you, they were all theoretical. And I am now going to take you along with me through a specific illustration wherein how we handled endogeneity using 2LS technique, how we introduced a dummy in our example, and how interaction dummy was utilized, and why, even though theoretically endogeneity was established, because econometrically we could not establish, we had to go back to the OLS model. The paper that I am going to discuss, where most of these concepts have been used, is chapter 4, and the article is Conflict, Climate Change and Food Security in South Asia. So in this model, the main dependent variable is food insecurity. In addition to several explanatory variables, the two variables of our interest are conflict and climate change. I will first start off by talking about the relationship that conflict has with food security, and it's a two-way relationship. Based on literature, there seems to be presence of endogeneity between conflict on the right hand side and food insecurity on the left hand side, as armed conflict could be both a cause as well as a consequence of food security. On the other hand, food insecurity also triggers, fuels or sustains conflict. So this two-way relationship is best handled through use of instrument variable approach, because we are expecting an endogeneity between them. To address this problem of endogeneity econometrically, we too adopted a 2SLS model, and we now needed the right kind of instruments of conflict. To do that, the best work in the area of conflict is by Collier, and Collier's book on the bottom billion largely talks about two major factors which promote conflict. One is grievance and the other is greed. When you are not too happy with your existing systems, you grieve about it and you are motivated to join an antisocial group. On the other hand, greed also motivates you to join an antisocial or a conflict driven set of group, because if there is more money over there, and especially if the money is the black money, much more is paid to youngsters who become antisocial elements. So both your grievance motivates you or pushes you to become antisocial, and greed pulls you to become antisocial. So when we had to find instruments for conflict, it was important that we have the instruments which are both pushing factors as well as pulling factors. So what are the instruments that we took? We discussed what would be the unemployment in that particular area. Are the education levels low, especially the gross enrollment ratio? If the males was really low, it means the children are not going to school, and when they are lying idle, the probability of their joining an antisocial conflict driven group is going to be higher. We also took parameters such as how much money was being dispersed by the financial sector for credit purposes so that these people could have their own startups. We also took parameters such as inflation rate and corruption to determine both grievance and greed. Now, when these instruments were analyzed and we started beginning to work on the 2SLS, we actually realized that the set of several instruments had to be rejected in favor of the OLS. So, what was going wrong? In a 2SLS model, your regression analysis involves selecting an appropriate instrument Z. So, if your instrument is Z or Z, or a combination of such instruments should be such that the covariance between Z and X should not be equal to 0 and covariance between Z and mu should be equal to 0. So, these are the fundamentals. Additionally, certain other criteria needs to be met. For example, in our case, the application of IV regression required certain prerequisites that did not ultimately be met. In our case, the prerequisites pertaining to 1. Endogeneity of armed conflict, 2. A value of F statistic greater than 10 in the first stage regression, and third, appropriate instruments that are relevant and not weak did not hold simultaneously. So, our conditions are not being held simultaneously. So, what do? Our estimates results are shared in the chapter which you could have a look. Our findings clearly indicated that IV technique was not an appropriate technique. And almost a week we had spent time collecting data, working on the instruments, and theoretically we knew that there was an endogeneity, but it was being rejected econometrically. So, there was a kind of initial disappointment between the researchers along with my co-author Dr. Harpreet. We were discussing that what is going wrong, are we misspecifying our model? But later, when several combinations of instruments and single-handedly instruments also did not work, we preferred to put a complete section in our chapter as what results we got when we used 2SLS, and finally we concluded under such circumstances, Woolridge in his 2009 book states that when instruments are weak, that is when the correlation between Z and X is low, the IV estimator can have a large asymptotic bias even if Z and mu are only moderately correlated. And in this case, it clearly states it is advisable to use OLS regression instead of an IV regression. This is precisely what we did, and therefore, in the entire chapter henceforth, our preferred model specification remained OLS. But we did not let this extra work go waste because we put it in a chapter, and later on we were informed that it actually enhanced the readability of the paper. I now give you a specific example of how we dealt with a dummy related to conflict. We are working on the paper and we know conflict is going to impact food insecurity, but somehow again our econometric works are not reflecting. So, either we could have left it over there that conflict, even though in theory is impacting food insecurity, it is not so, at least in the states of the 5 South Asian countries that we had analyzed in the paper. And during a cup of coffee with my own supervisor, who is my professional guru, Professor Raghavgaya, I shared my apprehensions with him and I said, sir, I am working on a paper, but conflict somehow is not turning out to be the way in which we had anticipated it. And I have already rechecked the data and kind of taken lagged values, this and that. And so, during the discussions, we realized that maybe what matters is not a one-time conflict, but a prolonged conflict. And prolonged, we decided, let's put it as 3 years. What happens if conflicts are there for 3 years or if they are not there for 3 years? Accordingly, so I'll just take you through. So, we prefer to then capture conflict as a dummy variable that takes a specific value depending upon whether the current year is with or without a conflict, along with distribution of conflicts in previous 2 years. As such, 3 conflict dummies were created representing various combinations of conflict. Conflict in all the 3 years, conflict in the present year but no conflicts in the preceding 2 years, or conflicts this year, conflict past year but no conflict in a year prior to that. And the reference category became no conflict in the periods which are the 3 periods. And the moment we try to define conflicts over a prolonged period, everything fell in place. And why did it happen? Because we expect that while households may have coping mechanisms to deal with food insecurity pertaining to conflict in the short run, say a year or so, such mechanisms may fail over longer time periods. And the longer time period, as I just mentioned, we took it as a 3-year period. And when we talked about our results and our findings, very clearly the picture that was emerging was years or countries where the conflicts were prolonged in all the 3 periods, the adverse impacts on food insecurity were the strongest and the most significant. So, capturing the parameter in its right spirit is also very important for an effective research. I also talk about in the same paper an interaction dummy, where we said if there is a conflict and if there is a climate change, what is independently the effect of conflict on food insecurity? We also independently studied what is the effect of climate change on food insecurity. Climate change was estimated through deviations in normal temperature and rainfall precipitation. So, there were 2 variables capturing the temperature aspect of a climate change and the precipitation aspect of the climate change. And we have adequate amounts of structural breaks where there could be a change in the anticipated relationship in the climate change. What we did was not just capture the effects independently, but also took an interaction dummy. What if the region is conflict prone, and what if the deviations from temperature or rainfall are also the maximum? So, 2 adverses, if they multiply and they magnify the problem, our impacts also became stronger on food insecurity. So, interactions must be utilized, especially related to your most important variables of interest. Supposing your left hand variable is not a quantifiable variable, it is a qualitative variable, it is a category variable. What kind of a regression then do we use? The alternatives could be, you could use a logit model or a probit model. If your left hand side is a 2 category, 1, 0 kind of a model, or a multinomial logit or a multinomial probit. So, multiple categories are possible in these cases. Alternatively, it could be an ordered logit or an ordered probit. What is the difference between a normal multinomial logit and an ordered logit? In multinomial logit, supposing your categories are 1, 2, 3, 4, and I take an example, if you look up this Venn diagram, there are 4 categories given over here. This is again based upon one of the papers on the safety net programs that India has, and we are trying to understand whether the 2 safety net programs, public distribution system and the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, are they substitutes or are they complements in the states of Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh? Our category variable was, is the participant only a PDS participant? We call it number 1, category 1, or is the household only participating in the workfare program, which is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme? Then we give it a category variable 2. What if households are participating in both Manrega as well as PDS? So, these households are classified as category 3, and there are some households which are participating neither in PDS nor in Manrega, and we classify them as 4, and this also becomes our reference category for the research paper. Now, when we talk about a logit model or a multinomial logit, we are often not interested in the simple coefficients that emerge. A post-estimation command is important, and it is here that we must work on marginal effects. And when we do the marginal effects, we got the correlates just for households which were only PDS, just for households which were only Manrega households, and also results or marginal effects for households which were participating in both Manrega and PDS. Now, simple theoretical books talk about two goods X and Y either as being only substitutes or being only complements. But when we took up this research paper, our idea was to find out whether the households in Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh consider Manrega and PDS as substitutes or as complements. Households which were participating in both safety net programs, we term them as households who consider the two programs as complements. Households which were participating only in PDS and not in Manrega, or only in Manrega but not in PDS, were thinking of the two programs as substitutes. Why is it important for a policymaker to know whether the safety net programs are substitutes or complements, and how is the public perceiving them? Simply because your resources are scarce, and if you as a policymaker in one particular state invest more in one safety net program, but it crowds away people from the other program, then the net advantages are going to be reduced. So, the best would be invest in programs where investing more in one program also lures the household to start participating in the other program. So, the beneficial advantages are expected to be wider and stronger, because the programs in one particular state were better governed. The households voluntarily wanted to participate in both the safety net programs, but in the others, maybe either PDS was too far away from their households, or standing in the queue would be much longer, not getting the item when your turn had come in a PDS or a fair price ration shop, lured people not to go to PDS very often. So, they preferred to be in Manrega. So, there are also cases where there is a very strong preference of Manrega over PDS, but equally we also have cases where there is a strong preference of PDS over Manrega, and several households are having both PDS and Manrega. So, the implications for policy is not just a policy, but the way in which it is governed is very important, and governments and policymakers must ensure that the institutions with which these mechanisms or safety net programs are working remain effective. If not, one must continue to work on reducing the leakages that are associated in these particular programs. If this is a multinomial logit, when do we use an ordered logit? Ordered logit would specifically be a situation where my 4 categories 1, 2, 3, 4 are ordered in a specific number. The example could be, which kind of a state do you prefer the most? So, it is a ranking of a scale of 1 to 5. So, most preferred people are ranking it at 5, least preferred are ranking it at 1, and that is the way the spectrum goes. So, if your ranking is chronological or hierarchical, there is an order attached to it. You cannot be using the multinomial logit here. Instead, one has to use the ordered logit, and then once again work with the marginal effects of an ordered logit or an ordered probit. In fact, your methodology section makes or breaks your paper when it is going for publication. How rich your methodology is, how much you are able to interpret your data, and your data sets, more unique they are, it creates a curiosity even for the publisher to incorporate something in that line. Once these sections of your paper writing are complete, comes the next section. Whatever methodology you adopted, what are the findings? And don't shy away from your findings. Sometimes findings are not commensurate or in line with what theory says. It is a time for you to introspect. Maybe the data you never inputted it properly in your stata. Sometimes cut, copy, paste and the whole variable goes haywire. So, double check your rows and your columns in your stata file. Play around with the data, draw scatter plots. draw histograms, understand your data. And if you're still comfortable that my finding is fine, stick with it and find a justification. I take an example once again from some of the work which I did on public-private partnerships. Often we would observe that public-private partnerships would be stronger or higher in areas where the governments are more fiscally constrained. Because governments don't have too much of fiscal space, they encourage private participation or public-private partnerships, especially in the area of infrastructure, be it telecommunication or transport. But when our regressions, we are working on South Asia and Southeast Asian countries, consistently we are getting a result where the coefficient turned out to be negative. In other words, the more fiscally constrained the government was, the less was the public-private partnership in that particular country. Now, this was contrary to the theoretical expectation, because we had started off with the assumption that where governments are going to be fiscally constrained, have less fiscal space, would be the ones which will be inviting. But that is only one side of the story. Your price cannot be determined just by the demand curve, there has to be a supply curve. And we realized that public-private partnerships were more where the governments actually had no problems related with fiscal deficit, because this gave credibility to the private player to have a partnership with the public sector. Another contrary results which we often get is, if you're working on a production function approach for India, let's say you're working on an agricultural production function, often you'll get the coefficient of labor to be negative, which means when labor goes up, the production function, the productivity or agricultural production goes down. Classic case of a disguised labor. So even though typically your textbook production functions will be talking about labor's contribution being favorable for production, but if you are in the third stage or your disguised unemployment, your coefficients will be negative. So don't shy away from your results which are contrary to expectation, provided you're very sure of your data sets, and provide a theoretical logic even to this contrary expected result. Fertilizers often will give you a negative if the proportion of the fertilizer is not right. For example, if your proportion should be NPK 4:2:1 and you are already working at 16:2:1, the moment you increase the contribution of N2 fertilizers, the impacts on production are expected to go negative. So, contrary to expectation. So, understand the foundations of your own research, fundamental spirit of what is happening, and then take it forward. After findings is your conclusion. Conclude your research work and your implications for the policy. Often my own doctoral students come to me and say, ma'am, our research paper is over, but we don't know what kind of implications to write for the policy. The test for this is, policy should emerge from whatever has been discussed in your paper, be it your left hand variable or your right hand. So, explanatory or dependent regressors and regressants, whichever variable has given you interesting results, take out policies from there. And it is also very important, while you are writing your implications for policy, throw some hints of data points. Now, once your paper is ready, it's ready for submission. There is a reference section up, so you have to put up your bibliography, your references, and different kind of journals want a different style. But I'm sure you by now would be knowing what kind of referencing styles exist. Once the paper is ready and it is gone for publication, reviews are expected, academic reviews. Sometimes you're very lucky and in the first go it is a clear acceptance. Sometimes it's a clear rejection. Otherwise, it could be a minor revision or a major revision. Do not get disheartened even if it is a complete rejection. Minor rejections, minor revisions, you work around it. Think of every comment reviewer has given to you as a constructive criticism. Work on it. Often they enrich the paper and they provide a different perspective which one probably had not thought of, because you are working in a narrow way and a narrow set of dimensions. So, remain open to constructive criticism, whether it is through your peer group or whether it is from the formal academic peer reviewers. What if it is a complete rejection? Still don't get disheartened. And in fact, at this point of time, there is an article by Gans and Shefford in 1994, and it is published in the Journal of Economic Perspective, pages 165 to 179, discussing only the times when there were publication setbacks faced by elite economists. How is it titled? How are the mighty fallen? Rejected classic articles by leading economists. And you will be surprised which are the articles that have been rejected. The seminal work by George Akerlof, The Market for Lemons, ultimately got published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 1970, but it had faced 2 to 3 rejections prior to being accepted over here. Jagdish Bhagwati's work on emissarizing growth, a geometrical note, was also rejected. Maybe the journal is not in a position to even appreciate your work at that time because it is so advanced. If your introspection reflects that yes, there were weaknesses in my work, it's the right time. Research is a never-ending process. Continue to improve till such time it sees a publication in one of the good journals. So now we come to the second part of today's interaction with you. It's all about reviewing a book. How do you review a book? How do you settle down on a particular book? I have a book which is a book by Raghbendhra Jha, Facets of India's Economy and Her Society, Volume 1 and 2. In fact, these are the two that you can have a look over here. So there is a Volume 1 and there is a volume. So this is a Volume 1 and a Volume 2. And both the volumes are closer to 300 pages. So it's a huge kind of a reading material meant for the students of economics, whether you are an academic student still doing your masters or an undergrad, or whether you are teaching economics. This is an important book. Why have I selected it for the book review? How to review a particular book? For several reasons. The most important and the obvious one is because it's a comprehensive review of Indian economy's different facets. And this is the National Resource Center on Economics. So a book on Indian economy, different facets of Indian economy, seem to be the most appropriate for the audience target. In this particular book, we have facets on economy, political economy, social economy, and also it is described from the lens of past to the present and also how we expect things to change in the future. So the continuum is a very beautiful way in which these particular policies in economics, politics and society have been discussed. It is really suited for the targeted audience, and also it has strong credentials of both the publisher and the author. So I am confident that the book that I am asking you to review is backed by a good publisher and written by an excellent author. But you are not supposed to go by what I am saying. How do you start reviewing the book? If you again have a look at this book, the title of both the books is the same, but the subtitles are different. In Volume 1, the subtitle is Recent Economic and Social History and Political Economy, whereas in Volume 2, the subtitle is Current State and Future Prospects. Before we start reviewing this particular book, how to go forward, it is important what are the components of reviewing of a book. When you are reviewing a book, you must introduce the author or the authors, including their titles and the place of work, and some indication of who they are, what kind of work they have done. What is the summary of the intended purpose of the book? Follow it up with the description of the way the author approaches the topic, the way in which the research has been carried out, the clarity of the argument, and the lucidity and flow of the text. You must also compare it with similar books in this particular field, because as a reviewer, we expect you to have enough of academic knowledge to be able to place this book in the context of other similar books in the area. An evaluation of the book's merits is important, its usefulness is important, and along with it, there are expected to be certain shortcomings. It is very important that you point that out also, because even now this particular author could be waiting for your review, which is a constructive criticism of the book that you are reviewing, to enable the author come out with better revised versions of the book at a later point of time. While reviewing a book, there are very important do's and don'ts. Do add flavor to the review by including significant facts, findings, or quotations from the book. Read the whole book. Do not compromise on that. And from the book, pick up important quotations or findings and put them in the flavor of your argument while you are building the story of your book review. As a reviewer, avoid repeating the table of the content. It is not so important to be repeating unless you are able to give a storyline to the table of content and build up another kind of way in which the table of content is being presented. If it's an edited volume, you need not necessarily edit or provide a review of each particular chapter in the edited book. You could confine to a few select articles, and each time you are reviewing a particular chapter of an edited volume, each time remain specific and provide details where required. And in this context, avoid being ambiguous. There are certain other characteristics of a good book review. As I mentioned, you must inform the reader what is the objective of the author while preparing the book in terms of, as I mentioned, the purpose, the content, and you must inform the quality of the book also to the potential reader. And the review has to be unprejudiced and balanced. The focus should be on providing constructive analysis, healthy criticism we all like, and it should be important for you to provide the gap areas which need to be filled, or an alternate viewpoint to the same data set. Simultaneously, if you have a couple of other journal articles or, as I mentioned, books, and these have not been used as reference by the author concerned, provide those additional references. While you are reviewing the book, your own language should also be simple, and you should be specific and not very long. Short sentences are what generally the reader appreciates. Add flavor to the review by including quotations from the book, and when you are finally writing, I take that approach. I start off by giving my general comments on the book or an article, and once the general comments are there, for example, it is well researched, it is well articulated, it is a fruitful or a value adding book. So, these are the generalized comments. I then follow up with my specific observations. We now come to reviewing this book, Facets of India's Economy and her Society, Volume 1 and Volume 2. This is by Professor Raghbendhra Jha. As I just mentioned, we should know something about the author. So, who is Raghbendhra Jha? Raghbendhra Jha is a professor of economics at the Australian National University. He has previously taught at Columbia University and Williams College in the United States. He's also been in the Queen's University, Canada, University of Warwick, UK, and he's also taught at the Delhi School of Economics, Delhi, IIM Bangalore, and IGIDR Mumbai. He has extensively published in the areas of macroeconomics, public economics, social welfare, and often the focus of his study is India. The first volume, it is about 300 pages, and it is on the recent economic and social history and political economy, and volume 2 is on the current state and future prospects, as I have already informed the participant about the structure of this particular book. Now, it depends upon how many pages or words that you have to write. If the book review is a part of your term paper or it's a part of your doctoral work, word limit is often not so much of an issue. But if this book review is to come in a particular journal, then you have to limit yourself to your words. I'm going to take a more lucid approach right now and give you the flavor of this particular two-volumed book. As I mentioned, volume 1 and volume 2. Volume 1 has 2 parts with 8 chapters. Part 1 has 6 chapters, part 2 has 2 chapters. Chapter 1 begins, it's a storyline, it's a narrative that I'm taking you forward as a storyline. Chapter 1 begins by an overview of the country's GDP over a very long time period, in fact going from 0 AD till the present, and certain future prospects is also mentioned. Chapter 2 is on population, land and labor. So, in a typical production function approach, Y is a function of population, land, labor, capital. So, your second chapter follows from the first. Thereafter, we often say if it is labor, the quality of the labor also matters. And this is there in chapter 3, which talks about human development index, the literacy of the labor, the quality, health quality, education quality and so on. This is then followed in chapter 4, 5 and 6, which talk about Islamic invasion, chapter 4, India's economy under British rule, chapter 5, and India's quest for freedom, chapter 6. Then comes part 2 of volume 1. 2 chapters, chapters 7 and 8. 7 pertains to governance, content of India's constitution. And finally, the last chapter in the volume 1 is political economy of economic policy making. So, once we are through with volume 1 comes volume 2. This comprises of 3 parts. Part 1 has 3 chapters, and these 3 chapters pertain to 3 important sectors of the Indian economy: agriculture, manufacturing, services. Thereafter comes part 2. It's emerging issues in India's economy, and it has 4 chapters. One is the global perspective, whether it's related to trade, investment, remittances, etc., followed by a development issue which is regional inequality, and in this, to address regional inequality, an important subsection is on the tax reforms, how taxes need to be collected in order to handle the inequalities. We follow it up with the next chapter, which is on education and health services totally. And the last chapter in part 2 is overview of the state of environment in India. So, you talk about water pollution, air pollution, etc. This is followed by part 3. It pertains to aspects of India's society and prospects for future. So, futuristic things have now come up in the last segment of volume 2. Very, very important issues have been handled. Women's issue, for instance, is the first chapter in part 3. Inter-community relations is the second chapter in part 3, and looking ahead is the final chapter of part 3, volume 2 of the book. Having given you a very broad storyline, and if you look up the book and you want to see whether I want to review it, what others are thinking of this particular book, it is important to find out how others are commenting, what are the reviews of other reviewers. And I now provide 2 reviews to the audience. One is by Edmund Phelps from Columbia University, and the second is by Raghavgaya, University of Manchester, UK. He was earlier associated with Delhi University as well. What does Edmund Phelps have to say? He says, Jha is the right scholar and economist to take readers through the development of the Indian economy. Readers will be in good hands. So, Phelps is sure that the readers will be in good hands when you are going through this voluminous 2-volume book. And Phelps, if you all know, was the Nobel Prize winner in 2006. Comes the second reviewer, Raghavgaya. What does he have to say? He says this is perhaps the best and the most scholarly contribution to understanding the Indian economy and society. Its rich historical perspective and a profound understanding of how India has evolved into a major economic power set standards of scholarship and analytical rigor that will be hard to surpass. So, in a way, Professor Ghaya is saying that the book is so good that it will be very difficult to surpass the rigor, the analytical rigor and the scholarly way in which such a comprehensive book has been written on several dimensions or several facets of India's economy, be it political, social or historical. Once you have read what others have done, begins your own work. Now you have to review the book. Just because, no, I'm not talking about necessarily of this book, just because others are saying only positives, you sometimes as a new researcher feel, oh my God, how could I possibly review somebody else's work? There are always areas where your thought process could be different from the way in which a particular author has written. Provide your perspective. And you may not be adept in knowing all the chapters, but surely there could be some specific chapters, let's say women's issue. I would actively encourage each of the NRC participants to pick up a particular chapter from the book for review. You don't have to review the whole book. If what you enjoy more is growth oriented, study and review the chapter on growth, that is your GDP. If what motivates you is the service sector, pick up the services sector. Similarly, if you are more interested to work on education and health, pick up the relevant chapter, or women's issue is another chapter. Find your area of interest and review that particular chapter. When you are reviewing, again, the do's and don'ts, start off with the generalized comments. For example, if it's the whole book, I would like to say the 2-volume book is a well-researched, informative and interesting read covering a plethora of topics related to the Indian economy. Specifically, first volume focuses on economic and social history of economy, analyzed from a spatial perspective, along with a discussion pertaining to India's political economy and providing a synoptic view of the country's governance, because first volume, last chapter, if you remember, was on governance. Second volume concentrates on the current state of the Indian economy, examining the performance of the country's agriculture, manufacturing and services sector, followed with a discussion of critical factors and so on. So you can continue in that dimension. Both the volumes provide an overview of the evolution of the Indian economy, and the book surely will be a great reference point for anyone wanting to apprise themselves of the events that define the country's contemporary political economic circumstances, its growth over time, along with the predicaments it continues to face. Now, when we are talking about this review, I will specifically talk about 2 or 3 chapters and review them. I begin by reviewing chapter 1. It's not the book review I am doing, it's a chapter review. So you must inform what is chapter 1 about, what is the relevance of GDP measurement. So understanding the pattern and growth of India's GDP is important. Why? Because it is important to comprehend the growth trajectory of the country and identifying the factors that have been critical in the country's growth experience. It is well recognized that Indian growth process has been steady, stable and diversified. Professor Jha presents important information pertaining to aggregate GDP of the economy over long periods of time with a disaggregated sector-wise short-term growth analysis. The period covered in the analysis starts from 0 AD to the periods of the Mughal and the British rules, followed up with the post-independence period to the contemporary times. The statistics-based discussion on regional variations, international trade, savings, investments, productivity in this particular chapter is extremely relevant for a reader and have been dealt with very enthusiastically and in a simple, lucid manner. However, in the analysis of economic growth, and it's the however because we are trying to identify a gap. However, the analysis of economic growth would have been richer had structural breaks been explicitly incorporated in the study, given that India in fact has experienced phase transitions in its growth. So, it's a very long period that is being discussed, and if there are structural breaks in the growth trajectory, maybe some discussions on that could have been inserted. It is important to incorporate the timing of structural changes since this provides information about the effect of economic crisis, changing in institutional arrangements, policy changes and maybe regime shifts. Some of it has been covered, but maybe marginally more could have also been discussed. I would now, let's say, talk about chapter 3. Chapter 3 in Professor Jha's book is about Human Development Index, and it provides the ranking, and it undertakes a very important discussion on the equality of outcomes, poverty and inequality in India. It measures the poverty, it links poverty with hunger, inequality, etc. So, very, very rich contribution. It starts off by defining even how the Human Development Index construction takes place. For example, the formula of xi minus x min upon x max minus x min, all these are elaborated upon. An interesting discussion undertaken is regarding the controversy surrounding measurement of poverty in India. So, that controversy of measuring poverty is very beautifully captured. The chapter also states, so there is an inverted comma, as I mentioned, you could throw some quotations from the book. The chapter states, living standards and inequality thereof form important constituents of the welfare of the country's citizen. However, this particular chapter fails to incorporate the distinction between inequality in outcomes measured through inequality in income and wealth and that of opportunities. The former emphasizes an ex post perspective, while the latter is an ex ante one. And a society can be said to provide equal opportunities when circumstances do not determine the differences in life outcomes. So, differentiating between inequality or outcome and opportunities could have been another subsection over there. I now take you to another chapter which is now in volume 2. It's a chapter on agriculture, a very, very rich chapter. But because my idea now is to review a book and to provide certain observations, and if I have to do that, I would say that in this particular chapter, maybe some part of climate change could have been incorporated because the impacts of climate change on agricultural productivity are expected to be adverse, and most of the recent contemporary literature is talking about climate smart agriculture policies. We could talk about over here things related to the climate risk index, the water scarcity index or the agricultural orientation index. So, some components here or there, but largely if I need to conclude, an extremely strong book which has practically covered several dimensions, if not all dimensions of the facets of India's economy, political economy, social economy through time perspective. I think it's, and for a single person to write so well, very well researched on all dimensions, it's normally some work which an edited volume would have done. Single author book, so rich in its referencing, in its research, is once in a lifetime opportunity for each one of us, and I strongly urge each one of you to read this book and provide your own review comments. And to conclude, I will pick up a quote from the book itself, and the quote is in the preface. If you look up the preface, this is the quote I am reading, and it's a quote by an Urdu poet, Ghalib Mirza. What does Ghalib Mirza Khan Sahab say? And this is written by Raghbendhra Jha. हज़ारों ख्वाहिशें ऐसी कि हर ख्वाहिश पे दम निकले, हज़ारों ख्वाहिशें ऐसी कि हर ख्वाहिश पे दम निकले, बहुत निकले मेरे अरमान लेकिन फिर भी कम निकले, हज़ारों ख्वाहिशें ऐसी कि हर ख्वाहिश पे दम निकले, बहुत निकले मेरे अरमान लेकिन फिर भी कम निकले. I translate, thousands of desires, each worth dying for. Many of them I have realized, yet I yearn for more. So, with this, I do hope, as Raghavendra Jha also writes, I hope this has been a stimulating reading. We wish and do hope that with this particular book, one more desire and dream of his has come true. We wait for his other desires and dreams to be coming true, which we could also then at another platform come back and discuss either in the classrooms or here. Thank you so much. It has given me immense pleasure to be discussing with the participants on two important topics pertaining to article writing and book review. Thank you once again for enrolling under ARPIT 2019 at the National Resource Center Economics at Sri Ram College of Commerce. Thank you so much.